Hi guys, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. So greatly appreciate it. Truly is. Before I get started, let me give you my usual disclaimer that this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Please do not take what I say as fact. Please always do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Next, if you have not liked, subscribed, or commented yet, please consider doing so. It would mean so much to me. It truly would. We are talking Marilyn Monroe, okay? The icon Marilyn Monroe. Before I did this deep dive, I knew little bits and pieces about her. In truth, I'm more of a Lucille Ball type. Like Lucille Ball that's my girl. I love Marilyn, I truly do, but Lucille Ball is my bitch. I'm just saying, that's my girl. But I loved looking into Marilyn. There's so much that I didn't know about her. So let's get started, okay? Marilyn Monroe was born Norma Jean Mortensen on June 1st, 1926 in Los Angeles, California, to Gladys Pearl Baker and Charles Stanley Gifford. Marilyn would always claim that this was her father. Oddly enough, it wasn't until recently, through a lock of Marilyn's hair and some really good DNA work, that they were able to prove 100% that this is her dad. Gladys and Charles met while working at Hollywood Film Developing Company, where they had a brief affair before going their separate ways. Gladys never reached out to Charles, nor did she ask him for money to help with Marilyn. She was later given her mother's baptized name, Norma Jean Baker, before settling on Marilyn Monroe and using that name for the remainder of her very short life. Gladys was first married when she was 15 years old, and she would have 2 children before Marilyn, okay? One day, Gladys is at work. Gladys comes home to find her husband in bed with another woman. There's a huge argument, and Gladys throws her cheating husband out of the house, okay? Shortly after this, the husband comes back and he steals the 2 children, and he runs off with them. Gladys would then spend all of her savings trying to find her children, okay? When she finally finds them, they are living in Kentucky, and she hitchhikes to where they are living, okay? This is crazy. Gladys is broke at this point because all the money that she had saved, she used trying to find her children, right? But she finally finds them. She goes to Kentucky, and then she hitchhikes to the home of her ex-husband, who is now happily married at this point and living in a beautiful home. When she gets there, she sees where her children are living, and she sees them surrounded by people who love them and who are good for them. And she knows that she could never give them that kind of life. She begins to remember her childhood and how poor she was growing up. And she doesn't want to do that to her children. Her father and her grandmother both ended up in mental institutions where they would eventually die, and her brother unalived himself. So she decided at that moment not to subject her children to that kind of life. And she quietly went back to Los Angeles, and went back to her job as a film cutter, childless, until Marilyn came along. Okay, so I know there's going to be mixed reviews on this. Did she do the right thing? Did she do what a good mother should do, or didn't she? I'm torn. Part of me thinks she did do what a good mother should do. The other part of me, maybe the selfish part of me, thinks, how do you walk away without your children? But at the end of the day, I'm thinking she did what a good mother does. Not be selfish enough to subject them to that kind of life because she wanted them. But let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section. So, after Marilyn is born, Gladys finds it too difficult to care for her. So she asks a letter carrier and his wife to take care of Marilyn for $5 a week. Because the couple needed money, they ended up agreeing to this. Then one day, seemingly out of nowhere, Gladys shows up to where Marilyn is and tells her that she has been saving her money and that she got a house for them. Marilyn and the couple that she's living with all go to live in this house together. She's going to paint it white, and Marilyn is going to have her own room. Gladys actually would make good on these promises, and the four of them would move in together to this home, and they wouldn't have to pay rent. All she asked of them was to take care of Marilyn while she was working. It seemed like an ideal situation until it wasn't anymore. Gladys would actually also be able to buy some furniture for the home and pay for it on time by working extra shifts. And she was even able to show up with an out-of-tune, a white grand piano from Marilyn that belonged to movie star Frederick March for Marilyn to take piano lessons on. I wonder if she had a gut instinct at that time that she was going to be the star that she was, right? But as we continue to talk about Marilyn's childhood, you realize that young Marilyn would never be able to catch a break. And it's super heart-wrenching, to be honest. It is. Then one morning, while Marilyn was in the kitchen having breakfast with the couple that take care of her, the three of them hear a loud thump going down the stairs. Okay? When the husband goes to investigate, he finds out that it's Gladys at the bottom of the steps. And he calls police and an ambulance. Because of the way that Gladys was acting and talking when the police arrived, she was taken to the Norwalk Mental Hospital, admitted, and she would actually stay there for the remainder of her life.
Now, a different lock of Marilyn's hair is being used to finally answer a long-time mystery. Who is the screen legend's father?
My heart belongs to Daddy.
John Resnikoff, president of University Archives in Connecticut.
I actually have several different locks of her hair, but the one that is probably most valuable and which was able to prove her lineage came from the embalmer.
It's that lock of hair that was used to find the identity of Marilyn's father. The DNA testing is the subject of a new documentary, Marilyn, Her Final Secret, by filmmaker Francois Pomez.
How certain are you that you have identified Marilyn Monroe's father?
100% sure.
100%.
So, who is he? His name is Charles Stanley Gifford. He had a brief affair with Marilyn's mother Gladys in 1925. Marilyn always claimed he was her dad, but he denied it. Now DNA tests proved, yes, he did father the biggest movie sex symbol of all time.
It was exciting news.
It was big news for Francine Gifford Deere, the granddaughter of the man we now know was Marilyn's dad. DNA from her actually matched Marilyn's.
Was Marilyn Monroe your aunt?
Yes, Marilyn Monroe was my aunt.
Now, nearly 60 years after her death, the final mystery surrounding Marilyn Monroe has been solved.
The furniture her mother bought for her was taken away, followed by her grand piano, followed by the couple that watched her, followed by the white home that was built for her. Marilyn would then find herself in an orphanage where she was given a blue dress and a white shirt, shoes with heavy soles, and these would be her prized possessions. Years later, when Marilyn was making good money, she was actually able to hunt down her grand piano and buy it back. And she had it completely repaired, and she proudly displayed it in her home. The piano now belongs to, ready? Oddly enough, though, the piano now belongs to Mariah Carey, who purchased it in 1999 for $600,000. Crazy, right? This woman she was just an icon. Everybody loved Marilyn. Everybody still loves Marilyn. She did something right. After Gladys went to the mental hospital, her best friend, so Gladys's best friend, Aunt Grace, would take Marilyn in for a bit. The only problem was that Aunt Grace had no job and she was scraping by. Actually, Marilyn and Aunt Grace would have to stand in line for hours just to get some bread and old milk. That is how poor they were. As Marilyn grew up, she realized that she was different from the other children, mainly because there were never any kisses or promises in her life. She often felt very lonely, so lonely that she would even want to die at certain times. She would try to cheer herself up by daydreaming about someone, anyone, loving her. After Marilyn went to live with Aunt Grace, she would hear Aunt Grace's friends telling her not to adopt Marilyn, saying that she was going to become more of a responsibility as she grew older, and reminding Aunt Grace that Marilyn's mother, father, grandmother, and uncle all ended up being mental cases. And Marilyn was sure to follow in their footsteps. In the end, Aunt Grace decided to adopt Marilyn, mental and all. Because Aunt Grace was so poor, she arranged for Marilyn to be sent to the orphan asylum in Los Angeles while she tried to find a job and get back on her feet. Marilyn would learn later in life that if it wasn't for Aunt Grace, she would have wound up in the state orphanage, which was much worse, where they deprived the children of privileges such as having a Christmas tree and watching a movie. That's terrible. It's terrible. These poor things. They make me feel so bad. Marilyn first went to live in the orphanage when she was 9 years old. Okay? When she was dropped off, she was screaming and crying, saying, "I'm not an orphan. I have a mother. I don't belong here." While living at the orphanage, she would stare out of the window at the Paramount movie water tower, and she would dream about being a star one day. She idolized Jean Harlow, and she would try to emulate her. After some time, Marilyn began to look at the orphanage as a kind of a safe haven. Since she was a little older than everybody that was there, she took on the big sister role. Okay? And she would even play the piano and entertain the children to try and calm them down. The orphanage attempted to emulate a real family. So in other words, the girls were allowed pets. I shouldn't say the girls. So in other words, the children were allowed to have pets. They would all have breakfast together. Then they would all go off to school. And then when they returned from school, they were all given chores to do. So they really tried to make it like a real family for the kids, which is nice considering the state orphanage wouldn't even allow them to have a Christmas tree or watch a movie. It's crazy. Those poor babies, those poor things. Marilyn would only live in the orphanage off and on. She was shipped off to 9 different families that would each be paid $5 a week to keep her. Most of the families had kids of their own, so Marilyn learned very early on that she was basically the black sheep. The biological kids would get the best clothing, owned all of the toys in the home, and they would always be the ones that would be believed over her. She would often dream about being so beautiful that people would stop and look at her when she walked by. That didn't come true. She dreamed of wearing beautiful clothes in beautiful colors and being admired by everyone. Little did she know that one day, every single one of those dreams would come true for her. Dream big, guys. Dream big. Growing up, Marilyn had so many questions about sex and love. But she had nobody to ask these questions to because she didn't have a mother. And she didn't feel comfortable going to these foster mothers. So, when Marilyn was 9 years old, she was living with one of the families. And the family had a friend of theirs, a man named Kimmel, who also rented a room from them in their home. Before I continue, let me give you a trigger warning that there's going to be an essay. Very short. It's going to be very short, but it's coming. So, if you want to skip ahead. Okay, so one day, Marilyn is walking past Kimmel's door. Kimmel has the door open, and he calls Marilyn to come in the door. Marilyn assumes that he wants her to run an errand for him. He gets up. He closes and locks the door behind her. And I'm sure that you guys can imagine what happens next. That was her first encounter with sex. After it was over, Marilyn runs to the mother of the home to tell her, okay? And before she can even get out what had actually happened to her, the mother of the home says to her, "Don't you dare say anything about Mr. Kimmel. He is my starboarder. While Mr. Kimmel stood in the doorway and watched and listened to all of this going on, the mother goes on to say, "Shame on you complaining about people." As Marilyn got a little older, she began dressing a little sexier. She would wear subtle but sexy makeup. And even though she never had sex on her mind, the girls at school would begin to accuse Marilyn of stealing their suitors. Maybe I'm a little biased, but look at her. I'm not surprised that the girls were jealous of her. She's beautiful. Even when she was young, she was beautiful. Then one day, Aunt Grace has a brilliant idea. She tells Marilyn to get married, okay? So there's actually more to the story. Telling her that the neighbor, Jim Doherty, was good looking, polite, and full grown. Marilyn was still unsure until she found out that the current family she was living with has gotten transferred to Virginia. So they were going to be packing up and moving to Virginia. This meant that Marilyn would find herself back in the orphanage. She didn't want to go back to the orphanage, so she decided to marry him. It was at that moment that she decided that maybe marriage wasn't such a bad idea to begin with. Marilyn would officially give up her orphan title in 1942 at the age of 16. Jim and Marilyn's marriage was more of a friendship with sexual privileges. His parents were not super fond of her. Maybe it was because she was peculiar. Maybe it was because she preferred to wash dishes instead of sitting with the adults. But still, remember, she's 16 years old at this time. Or maybe it was because she would sneak outside to play with the neighborhood kids until her husband would open the front door and call her in to come to bed. Like a father, like he was her father, I guess. In 1944, Jim joined the Merchant Marines, which was very common at that time. And Marilyn went to work for a parachute company. When Jim finally came back, he was ready to have a baby. And at that time, Marilyn was not ready to have a baby. In fact, she was petrified to have a child. She was scared that her child would end up poor and in the orphanage just like she had. So, refusing to have a baby would basically be the last straw and the demise of their marriage.
One of the famous actors said that she was the Hollywood. It's garbage. She probably turned him down. That's the reason he said that.
Today, her first husband exposes the truth behind the rumors and tells the secret of why Marilyn Monroe became his teenage bride.
Exclusive. Marilyn Monroe died 30 years ago tomorrow, but she still fascinates many of us, partly because her life and death was so mysterious. Today, we'll talk with Marilyn's first husband, a mysterious figure himself. Janet Tamaro with a look back at Marilyn Monroe.
The screen's most exciting woman, Marilyn Monroe.
She was the goddess of Hollywood, every man's fantasy on earth. But in the beginning, she was just Norma Jean Baker. She grew up in Southern California, raised by two foster families and an orphanage, after her mother Gladys was institutionalized for mental illness.
She was just shy,
self-conscious person. And people would tell her that she was beautiful, but she, I don't think, really believed them, you know.
Bebe Goddard was Norma Jean's foster sister and lifetime friend. The two girls went to Van Nuys High School together. But when Norma Jean was a junior, her foster family moved to West Virginia without her. To prevent her from going to yet another foster home, her foster mother came up with a solution. She arranged for the 16-year-old to get married to a local boy. His name was Jim Doherty, and he's now retired and lives in Maine. In a rare interview, he remembers the legend, who he still calls Norma Jean.
She was too young really to get married. It wasn't that we were not in love. She was just, I thought 16 years old was too young to get married, but she was fully mature, physically and somewhat emotionally. So when my mother said, would you like to marry Norma Jean, I said, sure.
Did she seem driven to be somebody?
No. She just, at that time, she just wanted to be a good wife, and she wanted to be secure, and she wanted to be loved, and she wanted to be feel like she belonged to somebody. It was very important to her.
But then World War II broke out, and Jim was sent overseas. Norma Jean stayed behind and got a job in a factory. That job turned out to be Norma Jean's first big break. One day, an Army photographer named David Conover came to the factory, looking for the all-American girl to use as a pinup model for war posters. Who did he find? Norma Jean. These are the first modeling pictures of the then 19-year-old Norma Jean Doherty.
I always felt that she would be something, you know, because she just, as I say, was too beautiful for her not to be seen.
Here, Bebe Goddard reads a letter from Norma Jean about the photo session with David Conover.
He said that I should by all means go into the modeling profession. He also said that I photograph very well and that he wants to take a lot more. Also, he said that he had a lot of contacts in which he wanted me to look into. He is awfully nice and is married and is strictly underlined business, which is the way I like it. Jimmy seems to like the idea of modeling, so I'm glad about that.
But I thought it was fine. She could do that until I got home. But then it got deeper and deeper, and she got more involved in it because I was gone so long.
Her photos came to the attention of the Blue Book Modeling Agency, and Norma Jean's new career took off. Dozens of magazines wanted her on their cover, and soon she was being offered a movie contract. But there was one hitch. The movie studio said she had to be single.
She just thought that, you know, she could get this divorce. We'd still go on as before, and she could have a career, and we could have everything the same. And I said, it doesn't work that way, you know. I wanted a family. And I didn't want to be Mr. Monroe.
Even though she said she still loved him, Norma Jean, who now called herself Marilyn Monroe, was starting to have big dreams, and they didn't include Jim Doherty. She divorced him and signed a movie contract with 20th Century Fox.
Everything she wanted to be as perfect as possible. Once she decided on a career, she realized that she could no longer be a good housewife or anything. She would have to be a good career person.
In 1947, she was cast in her first film, Scudda-Hoo, Scudda-Hey, but all of her scenes ended up on the cutting room floor. The next year, she landed her first lead role in the B-movie, Ladies of the Chorus.
There you go, judging people, criticizing them when you don't even know them. You won't.
But Marilyn was still struggling to transform herself into a sex symbol. Her performance was sweet, but it didn't get her noticed at the time. Columbia Pictures, which was paying her $75 a week, fired her after the film, and one executive said, I bet she never gets anywhere. But Marilyn was determined and set about improving her image, first by changing her voice.
Cynthia will just love that Royal Triton.
The one time I talked to her, I said, have you got a cold? She said, no. They told me my voice was too high. I had to lower it and talk in a lower tone.
On behalf of Photoplay Magazine, my congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. It's a great thrill.
In 1952, she was named that year's Rising Star. In the meantime, Jim had married again.
Do you remember watching her first movie?
No. My second wife didn't even want our children to know that I'd been married to her.
Did you ever see her again after you got divorced?
No. She knew that my second wife was extremely jealous. She didn't want to interfere with my family. And she knew I had a family, and I was happy, and I was doing great. I was a policeman.
After a series of awards in 1952, Marilyn landed her first major role in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, opposite screen star Jane Russell. Russell got $10,000 a week to Marilyn's $500, and Marilyn didn't even have her own dressing room. But the movie made her a star. Co-star Jane Russell remembers Marilyn.
Everybody wanted to help her because she was a very sweet, sensitive, super sensitive girl. In fact, she got her feelings hurt a lot of times when she really didn't have to because she was so sensitive.
Along with the fascination surrounding Marilyn's love life with second husband Joe DiMaggio and third husband Arthur Miller, there was endless speculation and gossip, ranging from a rumor that she'd had plastic surgery to one that she had 6 toes.
Debunk some of the great Marilyn Monroe myths for me.
She was raped when she was a baby by somebody. Forget it, she wasn't raped. That she was a lesbian. Pure, unadulterated garbage. And one of the famous actors said that she was the Hollywood prostitute. It's garbage. She probably turned him down. That's the reason he said that.
On August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe died of an apparent drug overdose.
Do you think she would be a legend today if she were still alive?
No. She'd be probably a chubby little old grandma.
Maybe. Then again, her diehard fans prefer the glamorous 66-year-old McCall's magazine envisioned in this computer-assisted photograph. They've, of course, allowed for a facelift. Even though Jim Doherty is now happily retired with his third wife and has put Norma Jean to rest, the world has never forgotten the legend of Marilyn Monroe.
I have little children come up here, couldn't possibly know her. Come up and want to know if they can have an autograph. The kids weren't even born. They were still a gleam in their daddy's eye, you know, when she died. I think it will go on. It'll go on. Who knows how long.
So at 19, Marilyn left the home and she went to rent a room in Hollywood where she tried to figure out who she was. 19 years old and living on her own, Marilyn started looking for jobs, posing for ads and layouts. It should come as no surprise to anybody that it was very easy for Marilyn to find photographers that wanted to take her picture. Again, she's beautiful. She was just stunning. She was just stunning. The problem was getting the photographer to pay more than just empty promises. Then one day, Marilyn's phone rings. On the other end is John Sylvester. John was a scheming peddler, and he called Marilyn to tell her that there was a talent scout named Samuel Goodwin, and he had asked for her specifically, okay? He goes on to say, would you be interested in a small role in a picture? Obviously, she jumps at this chance, right? This is what she has wanted. She hurries up, she gets dressed, she runs downstairs, and she waits for him to pick her up. John picks her up, and she gets in the car. They drive over to the rear gate of Goldwyn's studio. Now, this is at 7 p.m. and the lot is empty. He tells Marilyn that they're going upstairs to his office, an office that he shares with a Mr. Dugan. The two walk inside the office and Mr. Sylvester tells Marilyn to sit down on the couch. He hands Marilyn a script and he shows her the parts that he wants her to read, okay? As Marilyn is auditioning, he tells her to raise her skirt a little. So she raises her skirt just above her knees, thinking, okay, he wants to see, I guess, what I'm working with, right? So she does, and then she continues reading. Then he tells her to lift her skirt again, a little bit higher. So Marilyn lifts her skirt a little bit higher and she continues reading. Then Mr. Sylvester sits down next to her. And that is when Marilyn realizes that she is not there to audition for a role. There is something way more sinister going on. It's at that moment that Marilyn punches him in the eye, jumps up, kicks him, steps on his toes with her heel, and runs out of the office. Good girl. But now she's left jobless and penniless again. Not that Mr. Sylvester was going to pay her anyway, because I don't believe that he ever was. So, besides no money, no food, no money for rent, and holes in her stockings, Marilyn's biggest problem at that time is that she needs a car. This is essential in Hollywood at that time because you have to drive from audition to audition to audition. And sometimes you can find yourself at multiple auditions at a time for hours, right? So she needed a car. She was able to find a secondhand car and put money down on it, but she still owes $150 for it, okay? Could you imagine? That must be nice. $150. She couldn't pay. The following month, the dealership sends her a letter saying that they want their $50 payment, or they're going to repo the car. She can't pay it. Another month goes by and they send her another letter saying they want their money or they're going to repo the car. By the third month, there's a knock at the door. It's the repo man. And there was literally nothing that she could do except stand there and watch her car get taken away. Her only means of getting a job and making money and surviving, she just watched drive away. If that's not defeat, what is? Really? But right? Like, if that does not make you feel completely defeated, what does? Then one day, Marilyn's phone rings, all right? On the other end was a photographer named Tom Kelly. Marilyn had actually met Tom and his wife when she posed for a beer ad for him. He tells Marilyn to come over, that he has a job for her that pays $50. He went on to tell her that she would be posing for a calendar. Only catch. She would be completely naked. After going back and forth in her head for a bit, she decides to do it. I mean, desperate times, right? Desperate times call for desperate measures. No shade. And after all was said and done, Marilyn took beautiful pictures, which should come as no surprise to anybody. She was given her $50 and she was finally able to get her car back. After she gets her car back, Marilyn runs over to Aunt Grace's house to tell her even more good news. She landed a small part in a film with 20th Century Fox. The casting director suggested that she come up with a more glamorous name than Norma Doherty. Okay, fair. So Aunt Grace asks her, well, do you have any names in mind? She tells her that she's been thinking of the name Marilyn. Aunt Grace says, I love that name. That's such a pretty name. It is a beautiful name. Such a sexy name. Then Aunt Grace suggests that she uses her mother's maiden name, Monroe, and with that, Marilyn Monroe is officially born. In the end, Marilyn's part in the picture, let me get this right, Scudda Hay, was cut out. But Marilyn was okay with that because she had already been hired to work with them for the next 6 months. She would take the salary that she was earning and she would spend it on dancing lessons, singing lessons, and voice lessons. She would also sneak screenplays off of the set and read them alone at home in front of her mirror. That's how dedicated this woman was to making it. Nothing was handed to her. It was at that point that Marilyn finally began to fall in love with the most important person in her life, herself. Then one night, a potential suitor invited Marilyn out on a date. I know what you're thinking. He told her that he was invited to a famous agent's house in Beverly Hills. And he didn't want to go alone, so he asked Marilyn to accompany him. She threw on a $10 dress, stockings with holes in them, and awful shoes. After arriving at the party, she stood frozen, staring into a room filled with beautiful ball gowns, tuxedos, and famous people everywhere, including Jennifer Jones, Olivia de Havilland, Gene Tierney, and Clark Gable. This party would actually open the doors for her to get invited to more Beverly Hills parties, as it often does, right? That's often the way it happens, right? So, one night while she's at dinner, she meets a man named Joe Schenck. He invites her to a party at his mansion. He would go on to invite her to dinner at his mansion 2 to 3 times a week because that's how taken back he was by her. Joe was the head of the company that she was working with. That is until the casting department calls her into their office on a Monday morning. When she arrives, they tell her that she's no longer needed there. They tell her that the studio has decided that she's not photogenic. Yep. Crushed and defeated, Marilyn goes home. She lays in her bed for an entire week crying. She doesn't eat. She doesn't sleep. She doesn't even comb her hair. Then one day, the phone rings, okay? It's Mr. Shank. It's Mr. Shank's secretary. And she tells him that Mr. Shank is inviting her to dinner at his mansion. Remember, this is the guy that owns the company that now she used to work for. Okay? Of course, Marilyn accepts the invitation because she feels that it would be best. She goes to dinner. She sits through dinner quietly, not saying a word, with her head down in shame the entire time. Meanwhile, she had nothing to be shamed about, but that's the point. Before leaving, Marilyn questions Mr. Shank about the company and letting her go. She was able to tell by the expression on his face that he had no part of her being fired. However, he was not fighting to bring her back. He goes on to suggest that she looks for work at a company called X Studio. Okay? And Mr. Shank even makes a phone call to the person that owns the company, telling them that Marilyn is coming and to treat her well. I like to imagine that Mr. Shank and his company were sitting in their office at some point, kicking themselves that they let her go and slip through their fingers.
Mistake. Big. Huge.
Marilyn would end up getting several extra girl roles as a result of the call that Mr. Shank made for her, okay? Here we go. Then one day she gets called to Mr. A's office, who is the head of X Studio. She sits down in the office as instructed, and he walks over to her with a picture of a huge yacht. She compliments it, and she, completely taken back by it. She's like, oh my God, that's the most beautiful yacht that I've ever seen in my whole life. So he goes on to ask her if she would like to accompany him on the yacht. Marilyn's response is, of course I would. I've never been on a yacht party. So he replies, it's not a party I'm inviting you to. Okay, maybe she felt a little silly. So she goes on to say, I would love to accompany you and your wife on a cruise. To which Mr. A replies, leave my wife out of this. She will not be on the boat. It will be just you and I. Remaining the lady that she is, Marilyn very politely turns down his offer, and she tells him maybe at another time when I'm free. I'm not free this week. Mr. A turns around and he says to her, it's now or never. So Marilyn picks never. And good for her. You have to respect a starving artist, okay, that will not lower her standards to get ahead. You just do. She would rather be broke and jobless again than sleep her way to the top. And you have to respect her for that. If you don't respect her for anything else, you have to respect her for that. She's a class act. After this, she ends up meeting a couple from Burbank that tell her that they're leaving for a couple months and ask her if she would like to house sit for them. And this was a win-win because she would get to live in a house and she would get to live rent-free. So of course she jumps at this chance, right? Who wouldn't? She goes home. She packs everything she owns, which consists of 1 suit, 2 plain dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, and some ripped stockings, a little lingerie, and a bathrobe. That's it. That's all she had. That is all she owned. And she heads over to Burbank. Even though she was no longer an employee at 20th Century Fox, she was still getting checks from them. So, one day while she's out shopping, she spots a policeman on the street, okay? This poor thing. She walks up to the policeman and she asks him, is there anywhere that I can cash this check? I happen to be jobless, but I'm still getting like restitution checks from 20th Century Fox. Is there anywhere that I can go to cash my check? So the officer tells her, yes, follow me to this little store. They will cash your check for you. Great. Marilyn follows the officer to the store. She hands the clerk the check. He hands it back to her and he tells her, can you write your name and address on the back of the check? She does so, hands it back to him, and the clerk cashes the check. Meanwhile, the entire time, the police officer is standing over her shoulder. And although she thought it odd at the time, he was a police officer, so she didn't think too much about it, right? Okay. She thanks the employee, she thanks the officer, she's on her way. She does a little shopping, and then she visits her doctor. She tells her doctor that she hasn't slept in nights, and the doctor prescribes her some sleeping pills. Great. She goes home, she takes her sleeping pills, she goes to bed. Normal, right? Everything seems completely normal. Until it isn't. Marilyn puts on this short little nightie and she goes to bed. Okay? While she's sleeping, she hears a noise. She jumps out of bed and she runs over to the window where she finds a man cutting the screen to the window. How scary. How unbelievably scary. She begins screaming and she ends up spooking the intruder. She runs to a neighbor's house and after an hour, they decide to grace her with their presence. The detective ends up telling her that because she spooked the burglar away, that he is 100% sure that the burglar will not be back and there's nothing to worry about. That is wrong on so many levels. But while she's talking to the detectives, there's a knock at her door. The burglar's back. And he knows Marilyn's name. Okay? So, luckily the detectives were still there. But because he knew Marilyn's name and because he told them that he was her ex-lover, and because he knew Marilyn's name, they believe him. Marilyn is steadfast that she does not know this burglar. She has never seen him, and he is not her lover. So, why did he know Marilyn's name? Okay, we're going to get there. As detectives are frisking him, they find a police gun. Yes, a police gun, okay? And that's when it all clicks for Marilyn. The guy that is in her apartment is the guy that took her over to the check cashing place that stood over her while she wrote down her address, memorized her name, memorized her address, and came back for her. Officers end up taking him away. Then the following day, the detectives show up at Marilyn's door, okay? And they tell her that the officer they arrested is a rookie cop. He's recently married and he has a 14-month-old baby. That's great. So what? Then they ask Marilyn not to press charges on him because it will look bad for the police department. Although they assured her that he would never ever be back. I think against her better judgment, she said okay. And after that, she packed up and she moved back to Hollywood to rent a room again. While she's sitting at the counter at the corner store, Marilyn would meet a movie producer, okay, by the name of Mr. Cohen. He tells her that he's looking for a girl to play a role in the movie Love Happy alongside Harpo and Groucho Marx. The role was hardly more than a walk-on role, but she didn't care at that time. Like most starving artists that are trying to make it in Hollywood don't. They will do anything. So Marilyn's like, yes, I'll do it. I don't care. I'll take it. She goes down. She meets Groucho and Harpo Marx. She raves about them. And she does her bit. Afterwards, Mr. Cohen says to her that she is the making of a star. Understatement. And that he's going to find more work for her. Okay. And to just wait for him to call. Fine. Mr. Cohen ends up keeping his word, which is rare in Hollywood. And he asks her to help exploit the movie Love Happy for him. She ends up visiting several different cities. He agrees to pay all of her travel expenses, and he agrees to give her $100 a week. Okay. On top of this, the day before they leave, she calls him up to tell him that she basically owns garbage when it comes to clothes. So Mr. Cohen gives her $75 and tells her to go buy some clothes. Not a bad deal, right? It's not a bad deal. Okay. First stop is New York. Then Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Rockford. It was hot and Marilyn was miserable. Okay? She says that as hot as Los Angeles gets, She's never experienced heat like this. She spends most of her time while working on the road trying to cool off in bathing suits. And when press asks her what she can't wait for most, she says that she can't wait to return home. After she gets home, she makes friends with a woman, Lucille Ryman. Okay? Lucille was excellent to her. She would let her borrow her clothes, money, and would consistently reassure her that she was going to be a star. Then one day, Mrs. Ryman calls her up to let her know that there's a small role in the movie The Asphalt Jungle that she thought that Marilyn would be perfect for. She went on to meet with producers of the movie. They handed her the script and they told her to come back in a couple weeks after she learns the script. Marilyn runs home. She studies the script with her friend Natalie before deciding to return to the office to read for the execs. She reads her part once. Then she tells them that she's not feeling confident about the part that she read and she requests to read it again. They say fine. After she's done reading it the second time, the producers tell her that she nailed the part on the first time, and then they tell her to go down to wardrobe and fix herself up. Finally, right? When the picture previewed, all the studio heads came out to watch it, and it was a major success. Every time Marilyn would come onto the screen, they would cheer and the men would make wolf noises at her. She's, again, even though inappropriate, she's beautiful. She was just beautiful. And as far as the movie was concerned, she was a hit. As Marilyn's fame grew, the disdain from female Hollywood grew as well. Women didn't like her. They didn't like the way that she talked. Even if she wasn't talking to their husbands, they didn't like the way that she laughed. They believed that she was some sort of bedroom drawl. And they would always think that she was out to steal their husbands. There were even times that Marilyn would attend parties where nobody would talk to her. The men wouldn't talk to her because they were scared of the repercussions that they would face from their wives, and the wives wouldn't talk to her because they were all huddled in a corner like 12-year-olds talking about her. So again, she by no means had it easy. So while sitting at dinner one night with two friends, a director and a writer, Marilyn sits listening to them speak about Da Vinci. And she realizes at that moment that she's dumb. In her words. Those are her words, not mine. She didn't know anything about painting, music, history, books, geography, sports, or politics. So, tired of feeling stupid, Marilyn goes home and she enrolls in the University of Southern California. She would attend classes every day. After being enrolled for a few weeks, though, she realized that it was too much for her with her schedule. So she ends up putting her education on hold, promising herself that at some point in her life, she would go back to her education, which sadly never happens. Then, while she's at one of the many dinners at Joe Shank's house, Marilyn would meet and befriend famous actress Joan Crawford. After dinner, Joan would go up to Marilyn and give her some friendly advice and tell her that if she changes her wardrobe, it would do wonders for her career. At this point, the dress that Marilyn is wearing that night is the only nice dress that she owns. But too ashamed to tell Joan Crawford this at the time, she agrees to let Joan help her revamp her wardrobe. She goes over to her house for lunch, and after lunch, Joan takes her for a tour through her closet and her wardrobe, telling Marilyn about all the things that she would need to buy. Okay? Marilyn, too ashamed at the time to tell her that she has no money, agrees to make a list for Joan of all the things that she owns so that Joan can look at the list and tell her the things that she needs to buy and the accessories that she needs to go along with it. After lunch, Marilyn thanks her politely, as she always does. She thinks she's very polite. So she thanks her and promises her that she'll bring the list over to her, and she's on her way. She calls Joan one more time after that, promising to bring Joan the list. After that, she never calls her again. And she would in fact not hear or see from Joan until the morning after Marilyn presents an Oscar to one of the award winners at the annual Academy Awards ceremony. Okay, so Marilyn goes on stage, scared to death, does her spiel, presents her award, and goes back to her seat. Marilyn wakes up to see a statement in the paper from Joan Crawford saying, in part, Marilyn Monroe's vulgar performance at the Academy Affair was a disgrace to all of Hollywood. Marilyn would go on to claim in her memoir that the vulgarity that Joan was speaking of referred to the tight dress that she was wearing and how her butt wriggled in it. She says that she called her friends after she read what Joan had to say about her in the paper, and her friends assured her that she looked beautiful, which I don't doubt that, and that Joan was just jealous because Marilyn was now the young and seductive lady that Joan once was. Makes sense, right? However, there's a different theory that is circulating, okay? Marilyn does not say this in her book, okay? Stay with me here. After Marilyn's death, the head of the DA's medical legal section met with Marilyn's psychiatrist, okay? He agrees to let the DA hear tapes that he had recorded between Marilyn and himself, as long as the DA promises to never let another soul hear these tapes. He claims that while he was listening to the tapes that he took extensive notes and that he did not release any of this information until after the psychiatrist had passed away. Doesn't make it right. But he alleges that in part of the tapes, Marilyn can be heard obsessing about the Oscars and Joan Crawford. describing a sexual encounter between the two. And it is alleged that after their one-night affair, Joan wanted another round, to which Marilyn politely turns her down and says and explains to her that she does not enjoy doing it with a woman. Marilyn goes on to say in these tapes that after this, Joan becomes spiteful. Could it be true? Yes, of course it can. Is there video of Marilyn ever admitting this? Not that I've ever seen. So take it for what it's worth. With that, you're talking the 1950s, and women didn't do those things. So it could be that as well. But as far as I could see, Marilyn has never, ever, ever admitted to that from her own mouth. In the beginning of her career, Marilyn would lie in interviews. She would, mostly about her parents. She would tell reporters that her mother was dead and that her father was somewhere in Europe. She says that she did this because she was too embarrassed about the truth, that her mother was in a mental hospital and that she didn't actually know who her father was. When she finally decides to come clean, she is pleasantly surprised by the reaction, and everybody is kind to her. Nobody picks on her, and then rather they embraced her, which is nice, because in truth, it wasn't her fault. The things that happened to her weren't her fault. She thought that newspapers and magazines were going to write awful things about her, and that didn't happen. And rather, the public completely embraced her, and they felt sorry for her. They felt compassion for her. So that was nice to hear, because she's been through so much, this poor thing. Then, not long after this, Marilyn gets word that her nude calendar was going to be put on the market as a Marilyn Monroe novelty. Fearing the calendar would destroy her career, she reaches out to a writer friend of hers, and when she tells him her concerns, he laughs at her, telling her that this calendar is going to be the biggest bang the town has heard in years. He goes on to tell Marilyn a story about a girl in the 20s who was on the verge of movie fame, saying that she couldn't quite excite the movie queens or the makers at the studio. Then one day, a studio official got a hold of a film in which this girl was performing. In the film, the girl danced entirely in the nude, and the dance was vulgar and suggestive, to say the least. It ended up haunting the minds of every movie exec at the party, and they began to vie for her services. She became famous in a matter of months. And this story would almost mirror Marilyn's after the release of her calendar. Everybody wanted Marilyn to star in their movie. But she ended up choosing two films, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire. After these movies, she was finally making great money. $1,200 a week, which at one point was more than she was making in a 6-month period. So she had clothes, fame, money, a future, and all the publicity that she could imagine. But despite all this, Marilyn was still depressed, which goes back to the old saying, money can't buy you happiness, right? Her life began to feel wrong and unbearable, just as it had in prior years. Marilyn had quite a few bad social habits, and she actually acknowledges them in her memoir. She was always late. If she had a dinner date at 8 o'clock, she would be sitting in a bathtub at 8 o'clock. She loved to take ice baths because apparently it would help keep her skin firm. She would also infuse these baths with Chanel No. 5. She would let the water run out and she would refill the bath. She attributes these habits as her way of rewarding her old self, Norma Jean. This is because when Norma Jean was living in her foster homes, she would, because these families were so poor, they would use the same bath water for everybody. And because Marilyn was the, misfit, I guess, she would always be picked last to take the bath. So she would have to bathe in bath water that 6 to 8 people had bathed in before her. And now the Norma in her can bathe in all the fresh water that she wants. And she embraced that. And who could blame her, right? You can't blame her. There's something so sweet about that. There's something so sweet there, and there's something so special about that. There really, really is. After all that she's been through, or after all that Norma Jean has been through, she can take 20 baths in a day, all in fresh water if she wants. And that's something really significant. After getting out of the tub, Marilyn would spend up to an hour rubbing cream on herself. It's rumored that Marilyn had to go on a strict skincare regimen because she dried out her skin from washing it up to 5 times a day to prevent breakouts. Being late made something inside of Marilyn happy. It wasn't because she was mean by any stretch of the imagination. For the first time in her life, people were waiting for her. People were eager to see her. People were eager to hear what she had to say. She was no longer the servant girl, Norma Jean, that nobody wanted to see or talk to, not even her mother. It's sad, right? After the calendar dropped and the public found out the real story of the troubled childhood behind the beautiful icon, Marilyn became so famous that fan mail started flooding in. At one point, she was receiving more mail than the top box office star, Betty Grable. Go, girl. The irony of being such a huge sex symbol is that Marilyn never did anything vulgar on or off the screen. She worked 12 to 14 hours a day. She had a goal, she had a dream, and she was determined to make it a reality. She wasn't unhappy or depressed for the first time in her life. She was just dull. That's actually, those are her words, actually. She was just dull because all she did was work. She had been working so hard that she had actually forgot about living. That's how hard she was working, because that's how much she wanted to achieve her goal. And if I had to, I would accredit it to, this girl was never handed anything, ever. Never, ever, ever did anybody hand her anything. The only thing that anybody ever handed her was disappointment, rejection, and hatred. Really. Then one night, a friend from the studio told her about a famous baseball player named Joe DiMaggio. At the time, Marilyn had no interest in meeting him, okay? She wasn't into baseball, and she didn't like men that wore loud clothes. But she went to the dinner party anyway. So, while at the dinner party, the host introduces her to Joe DiMaggio, and Marilyn is pleasantly surprised. He wasn't the loud, sporty fellow that she had expected, but rather he was a reserved gentleman in a gray suit with a gray tie and a sprinkle of gray in his hair. She was instantly attracted to him, but thought that she could never impress such a famous ball player. On top of this, there was very little conversation between the two, because Joe DiMaggio spoke very little and Marilyn was so shy that she spoke very little. After a little while, she tells the host thank you, as usual, because she's so polite. She thanks the host and she tells them that she's going to leave. It's at that point that Joe DiMaggio stands up and offers to walk her to the door. Once they get to the door, Joe DiMaggio offers to walk her to her car. Once they get to the car, Joe DiMaggio asks her if she would mind giving him a lift to his hotel, which is about 5 minutes away. So, of course, she says yes. And the entire time that they're in the car, they don't say anything until Marilyn pulls into the parking lot of the hotel. So once she pulls into the parking lot of the hotel, Joe DiMaggio turns around and he says to her, "It's a beautiful night. I really don't want to go home. Do you mind driving around?" So of course she says, "Oh my God, yes," because at this point, she really likes this guy. Like, she has butterflies for this guy. She doesn't know why. She doesn't know what she's really feeling, but she knows that she's feeling him. So she says, of course. They drove around for 3 hours that night. The first hour, they talked and they said, they got to know everything about each other, right? Then she says that it got a little bit silent in the car and they were driving around, maybe like half hour, 40 minutes at one point, just in silence. But it was still one of the best rides. Like, in other words, even though they were driving around in silence, she loved it. And I guess that's when you know that you really love somebody, when you could sit there in silence and have the best time ever. That's when you know that there's something truly magical there. The pair dated for 2 years, and Marilyn quickly moved into his San Francisco home before they decided to move into their own home in 1953. They tied the knot at a San Francisco courthouse on January 14th, 1954. Because it was an elopement, Marilyn opted out of wearing a traditional white gown, and instead she wore a dark brown suit with a white fur collar. The pair were probably doomed from the start, mainly because not only was DiMaggio very jealous, but he also hated the spotlight, despite the fact that he was one of the best Yankees of all time. He hated the spotlight, he hated the paparazzi, he hated the pictures, and he hated the men. Marilyn, on the other hand, she was used to it, right? So this was her job. This came along with her job, and she did what she had to do. And as far as she was concerned, if you want to be married to me, you have to accept this. During their honeymoon to Japan, the pair would end up having an argument because Marilyn was asked to travel to South Korea to perform for the troops, and she accepted. She accepted for two reasons. One, because it was her job and she wanted the money, but more importantly, she accepted because it was for the troops. So you got to respect that. The real problem came while she was filming the movie The 7-Year Itch. This would be the movie with the ever-famous dress blowing in the air while Marilyn stands on a grate. Fans and paparazzi from all over came to watch this take place. Okay? Among the onlookers was Joe DiMaggio, and he was not happy about it. He leaves early because he's so upset by all the men gawking at his wife. And it's even reported that when she returns to the hotel that there is a blowout argument, and it's also reported that there is ABUSC from him towards her. By multiple people, actually, I should say. Multiple people report that they had a huge blowout and that he put his hands on her. So that happens. And then after Marilyn returns to Los Angeles, and just 9 months into their marriage, in October of 1954, Marilyn files for divorce, citing mental cruelty. Marilyn and her attorney would hold a press conference on the lawn of the home that she shared with DiMaggio to let the public know. Marilyn would move out of the home and into Brandon Hall Apartments behind Sunset Tower. Joe's jealousy became amplified after this. He was certain that Marilyn was sleeping with her vocal coach, Hal Schaefer. He was correct, and Hal comes out later on and says that he was. But it wouldn't matter anyway, because at this point their divorce was final. He would also be convinced that the couple was using Marilyn's best friend Sheila Stewart's apartment for their rendezvous. And he would be correct.
She quickly found comfort in the arms of Hal Schaefer.
I thought that she was like a little flower, hadn't yet bloomed. I thought there was so much to her that hadn't happened yet. And she was so basically such a good soul, in my opinion. So, yes, we did get romantically involved. I spoke to him once on the phone, and he, in such a very nice manner, asked me to come over to the house to meet him and have a talk, man to man.
The love-struck Schaefer was ready to take up the challenge.
He did physically, and that's what enraged me so much that I was willing to go and confront him, because I truly loved him. And he was, I don't know, twice my size or whatever, but I was on my way to confront him. But she said he would make dog meat out of me. Had us followed, had our cars bugged, had the phones bugged. It was a bad time. We were very close to making love. I don't remember the stage we were at, but I would say half-dressed. And all of a sudden, for some reason, Marilyn got these vibrations, and we went over to the window, and we saw this group standing across the street. One of whom was Joe DiMaggio, and another was Frank Sinatra. They all came en masse and broke this door in, demolished it. We scrambled to get out the back way, and we made it, luckily.
Okay, so DiMaggio's friend, Frank Sinatra, suggested that he hire Private Eye Barney Rudinsky to track Marilyn's every move. November 5th, 1954. Marilyn gets in her white Cadillac and she drives over to Sheila's home. She parks the car on the curb and she goes inside. DiMaggio and Sinatra are at a popular hangout, Villa Capri. Okay? While they're there, DiMaggio gets a call from Rudinsky's. Okay. While they're there, DiMaggio gets a call from Rudinsky's rookie private eye. He tells DiMaggio that Marilyn's car is parked out front of Sheila's apartments. DiMaggio orders Rudinsky to meet him over there immediately. So Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra go over there. And they are planning a raid to catch Marilyn in bed with her vocal coach and essentially ruin her career. Okay? So, there's questions of everybody that was there that night. But it is confirmed that Joe DiMaggio, Frank Sinatra, Brian Rudinsky, the private eye Brian Rudinsky, Brian's wife, the rookie private eye, his wife, and the maitre d' Billy Karen. They were all there. The building that Shelley lived in housed 3 apartments, 2 units, 8120 and 8122, which fronted Waring, and a 3rd unit that faced the side. So they essentially had a 1 in 3 chance of getting it right. Spoiler alert, they got it wrong. The door they picked belonged to 39-year-old secretary Florence Katz, who lived alone in the home. Florence was sound asleep in her bed with rollers in her hair when she heard somebody with an axe at her kitchen door. When she got up to see what was going on, and then when the men saw Katz, they screamed, "We've got the wrong place," and they ran out, breaking a bunch of glass. LAPD investigated it as a burglary, but it was dark and there were flashes from the cameras, so Florence wasn't actually able to see who it was that was in her home. And she was unable to identify any of the men, so the case essentially went cold. That is until almost a year later, in September of 1955, when Confidential magazine ran a story about the wrong door raid, naming DiMaggio and Sinatra as being part of it. Sinatra and DiMaggio would find themselves in court in 1957. They both claimed that they were there that evening, but that neither one of them went into the Katz's apartment. Barney Raditsky, who was the private eye, denied that his company had anything to do with the raid or investigating Marilyn. His ex, well, it was his ex at the time, ex-rookie employee Phil Irwin sang like a canary, and he told the court everything. Sheila Stewart testified that she saw two men running away, but that she wasn't sure of their identities.
Well, the elderly woman eventually won a court settlement. In addition, it had become known to authorities that a private investigator had accompanied Frank and Joe that night. This launched a state investigation to see if private detectives were selling out their clients to scandal magazines. Frank Sinatra testified that he was just an innocent bystander.
Will you tell the committee the circumstance under which you happened to be there?
Well, I drove Mr. DiMaggio to the general area. Didn't...
You mean Mr. Joe DiMaggio?
There's only one that I know of, actually.
There are five brothers.
Well, he's probably the hottest one.
Meanwhile, Confidential had bought the detectives' file of the raid, and this became their hottest story ever. But at the same time, they had crossed Frank Sinatra, who had influential friends. The magazine had also elicited the watchful eye of the government. While the Kraft Committee produced no charges against Confidential, then California Governor Goodwin Knight called for an all-out war against the magazine and its tabloid imitators.
The jury deliberated for 14 days, and in the end, they turned up deadlocked. The state agreed not to retry the case as long as Confidential magazine agreed to stop running stories about Hollywood's intimate secrets. Marilyn would then meet her third and final husband, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Arthur Miller, in 1951. And the two actually remained friends for 5 years. They met on the set of the movie As Young as You Feel. And during those 5 years, Marilyn married DiMaggio and Arthur married his wife. Prior to their courtship, both Marilyn and Arthur were trying to fix their marriages, but neither one of them were successful. And the two would end up falling in love with each other. Marilyn was already divorced from DiMaggio at this time, but Arthur Miller was not divorced from his wife yet, Mary Slattery. They were separated, though. Arthur Miller ended up purchasing a home in Nevada, and which was near to Marilyn, and they would end up working on their courtship. In 1956, the couple would decide to go public after Arthur's divorce from Mary Slattery was final. Marilyn was actually urged to break up with him for the sake of her career, but she chose not to. If we know anything about Marilyn Monroe, then we know that she beats to her own drum and she just does what she wants. The couple would end up marrying on June 29, 1956, in a small ceremony at the home of Miller's agent in Westchester, New York. They would spend the first few months of their marriage in the United Kingdom before settling on Miller's farm in Roxbury, Connecticut. They stayed married for 5 years, which is actually longer than both of her marriages. But Marilyn had fertility issues, and this put a great deal of stress on their marriage because Marilyn wanted to be a mother. It is said, though, that the final straw for Marilyn was when she found journal entries of Arthur's that stated that he was disappointed in her She embarrassed him in front of his other friends, and the only one that he will ever love is his daughter. In 1961, Arthur wrote a screenplay called Misfits. This is the final ditch effort on his part to give Marilyn Monroe a chance to show her dramatic skills. But the shoot would end up being a disaster, and they would divorce shortly after this. Okay, let's talk Hugh Hefner, Marilyn Monroe, because I was unaware until this deep dive that Hugh and Marilyn had actually never met, and they've only spoken to each other one time on the phone. Because from the way that he spoke about her to buying the plot next to her, I thought that they were very close, and I was actually convinced that they were sleeping together at some point. Because doesn't it seem kind of odd that he would buy the plot next to her? I mean, I feel like there's so many other people that he could have spent eternity with, but to each his own, right? December 1953. Marilyn would jumpstart Playboy magazine by gracing the first cover, and in an ironic twist, the last new photos ever taken of Marilyn would appear in the magazine 10 years later. So, how's this all come about? The first time Hefner laid eyes on Monroe was in the movie Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and he fell in love with her right away. So, how did she land the first cover of Playboy? Ironically, that picture was not taken at Playboy, and she was not posing for the magazine at the time. That picture was taken by Playboy's art director, Arthur Paul, while Marilyn was sitting on the back of a car waving. At the time, Hef was just starting out and he didn't have a lot of money, and he needed something that would jumpstart the magazine. That's when he learned that Marilyn had posed nude in the calendar. And at the time, not many people had seen the calendar because the post office wouldn't allow nudes to be sent through the mail. Hef finds out who owns the right to the calendar pictures, and conveniently enough, the man that owns the right to those pictures did not live far from him. So he drove over there, and he was able to convince the guy to sell him the rights to the pictures for $500. Playboy. Before it was Playmate of the Month, it was Sweetheart of the Month. And before it was Playboy, it was Stag Party. And before there were Playboy bunnies, there were stags. Right before the magazine was to be published, Hef got a cease and desist from Stag Magazine, saying that they believed that the magazine, that the logo Stag Party would be an infringement on their name. So Hef decided at the last minute to change it to Playboy and to change the mascot from a stag to a sophisticated bunny. And thank God, like, could you imagine wearing a stag around your neck? Talk about a blessing in disguise. Marilyn's second encounter with Playboy would come 10 years later during the filming of the movie Something's Gotta Give, where Marilyn did a naked pool scene. These would be where the last nude photos of Marilyn were ever taken. Okay, so this next part, I was going back and forth with if I should even put it in because there's zero hardcore evidence about it, and I don't like doing that. But since it is such an important part of the story, I've decided to include it. I'm just going to advise you to take it with a grain of salt. It is alleged that Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy first met at a dinner party in 1962 when they were introduced by none other than Frank Sinatra, who was part of the Wrong Door Raid. The following month, JFK invited her to spend the weekend with him and Jackie Kennedy at Bing Crosby's home in Palm Springs. It is said that this weekend was the extent of their affair. But that did not mean that Marilyn didn't daydream about being JFK's second first lady. And it's also alleged that Jackie Kennedy knew about the affair between Marilyn and JFK. It is said that Marilyn purchased a gold Rolex for JFK for his birthday that was inscribed to say, "Jack, with love always, Marilyn, May 29th, 1962. She allegedly gave it to Kennedy's aide, Kenneth O'Donnell, to pass it along to Kennedy, and when Kennedy saw it, he told O'Donnell to get rid of it. If that's true, then it would make sense that he told him to get rid of it because he's the president of the United States, so therefore something like that could not be found, right? May 19th, 1962, 10 days before JFK's real birthday, Marilyn Monroe took to the stage at Madison Square Garden and she sings Happy Birthday to JFK. Many would use this performance as proof that the two were sleeping together. Do I think it's possible? Absolutely. I mean, have you seen her? She's beautiful. She's absolutely stunning. Who wouldn't want her, right? On the other hand, she was a sex symbol. So her sexy version of Happy Birthday doesn't actually prove much in regards to an affair, in my opinion. But while we are on the topic of the Happy Birthday, Mr. President, we have to discuss the recent shockwaves heard around the world when Ripley's, believe it or not, allowed Kim Kardashian to wear and ruin a piece of American history. The dress that was worn by Marilyn Monroe during that performance. And no, Ripley's, I cannot believe you did that. Like, what were you thinking? Nobody has earned the right to wear that dress, especially a Kardashian, in my opinion. Look, with all due respect, Marilyn was completely against sleeping her way to the top. She refused to do it. And she was propositioned multiple times. She was also propositioned to marry millionaires that were about to die so that when they died, they would leave her their millions. And she said no. She wanted to earn her money the old-fashioned way by working. She worked 14 to 16 hours a day. She would rather be penniless and jobless than forfeit her self-respect. I'm going to try to be nice here. I truly, truly am. I'm not even trying to be an a-hole. Kim Kardashian and Marilyn Monroe are not now, nor will they ever be in the same category. They just won't. I'm trying to say this with so much respect. I truly am. But Ray J. But what are your opinions on Kim K wearing Marilyn's dress, ruining Marilyn's dress? Do you think I'm being too harsh? Tell me. Are you mad that she was allowed to wear the dress and ruin the dress? I mean, when she realized that the dress didn't fit her, that should have been a wrap. Except it wasn't, and now she ruined a piece of American history.
Was the most famous dress in American history damaged after Kim Kardashian wore it? That's the question being asked today about the iconic beaded Marilyn Monroe gown Kim wore at the Met Gala 6 weeks ago. It had only previously been worn once before by Marilyn when she sang Happy Birthday to JFK in 1962. New side-by-side photos of the back of the dress taken before and after Kim wore it appear to show stretched fabric and missing beads. Marilyn collector Chad Michael Morissette took the after photo during a recent visit to Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Hollywood.
The backside of the zipper, all the way up the zipper, the fabric is completely frayed and torn and ruined.
When you talk about damage, is it irreparable?
They don't make this fabric anymore.
Kim has said she lost 16 pounds in 3 weeks to fit into the slinky dress. Video showed her struggling to get it over her derriere.
Do I need to put on another pair of shapewear? Once it gets up, it'll fit the back.
She ended up wearing a fur jacket that covered her backside because the dress didn't zip up the entire way. I'm here at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Hollywood. I'm going to head inside and check out the dress firsthand. It appeared the once pristine fabric by the zipper was stretched out and some beads appeared to be missing. Also, the bottom appeared to be frayed. When Ripley's brought the $10 million gown to Inside Edition, it arrived in a protective box, and a Ripley spokesperson told us every precaution had been taken.
We talked with our team to make sure that everything we did was to ensure that the dress would stay in pristine condition.
But was Marilyn's dress really kept safe?
It is irreversible damage that happened that night.
Kardashian's responding to those allegations that she ruined Marilyn Monroe's dress.
Did she or didn't she?
We keep seeing stuff like the dress is ruined, the dress is this. All of that is not true.
No.
Kim Kardashian breaks her silence about whether she ruined the iconic Marilyn Monroe gown she wore to the Met Gala.
There was handlers and gloves that put it on me.
Ripley's has said that the dress wasn't damaged.
The allegations started when these before and after photos circulated online. It allegedly showed stretched fabric and missing beads. But Kim says she didn't wear the dress long enough to cause that much damage.
I showed up to the red carpet in a robe and slippers, and I put the dress on the bottom of the carpet.
Oh my gosh.
Went up the stairs. I probably had it on for 4 minutes. And then I changed.
Saturday, August 4th, 1962. 36-year-old Marilyn Monroe spent the day at her Brentwood home. She was on her third divorce and had been rejected by the Kennedy brothers. She was also seen as promiscuous, and there was an alleged abortion. Along with her family's history of mental illness, prior attempts of unaliving herself, and her addiction to sleeping pills. Okay, fair. The other side of the coin says there is no way that Marilyn did this to herself. Those closest to her claim that in the days leading up to her death, she had never been happier. She had bought her first house. Her career was beginning to get back on track. She had actually had plans to go back to work on Monday. She was on the cover of both Life and Paris Match, along with, she made the cover of Playboy. she had 23 films that grossed more than $250 million in 1962. That's a lot of money. That's, in today's day, that kind of money is like some Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos money. Like, it's not chump change. She never needed to work again anyway. Some have accused the Kennedy brothers of being responsible for her death, claiming that JFK wanted to run for another term and that because of this, his wife Jackie wanted her out of the picture. Could it happen? I suppose so. But we're talking about the President of the United States. Do I think that if he really truly was involved, that his involvement would have stayed a secret for all these years? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I truly don't. But even today, 6 years later, the cause of her death is still up for debate. Will it ever truly be solved? I hope so, but I have my doubts. This actually got me choked up while I was researching it, so I'm going to try to get through this part because it's really sweet. Okay. It is also said that Marilyn and Joe DiMaggio had begun rekindling their relationship in the months leading up to her death, and that they had planned to remarry. Some say that they were supposed to remarry on August 8th, 1962, the day of her wake. It's really sweet. It's really sweet. It's really tragic, but it's really sweet. Joe DiMaggio took complete control of the funeral. He only allowed 30 particular people to attend the funeral. Her ex-lover and voice coach was not allowed to attend. Her third husband chose not to attend because he said that her funeral was going to be made into a circus, and his theory would end up being correct after hundreds crashed her funeral. Was it right? No, but she was so beloved. It's not surprising. Okay. The funeral took place in a small chapel at Westwood Memorial Park. After the minister read his sermon, I know I'm a crybaby, guys. I'm such a crybaby. I'm sorry. I'm such a crybaby. After the minister read his sermon, DiMaggio stood over her casket, eyes filled with tears, and gave Marilyn one final kiss before placing 3 roses in her hand and whispering, "I love you." That evening, after all the mourners had left, DiMaggio returned to the deserted cemetery and sat with her in the dark. He would do this for years to come. He would also send red roses to Marilyn's grave twice a week for the next 20 years. Lastly, it is reported that his final words were, "I finally get to see Marilyn." I want somebody to love me like that. Like, what the fuck? I want somebody to love me like that. But with that, why did you have to be a jerk? Why'd you have to be a jerk to her? For real. But that's that. Okay. If you guys are still here, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you all. I'm sorry I'm a crybaby. I am. I just thought it was so sweet and so touching. I really did. If you have not liked, subscribed, or commented yet, please consider doing so. Please leave me a like. Please leave me a comment. It would mean so, so much to me. Truly, truly would. If you have any suggestions, email them to me at harding527@yahoo.com. And until next time, I love you all.